everyone. Good evening. My name is Spencer Ruckdy. I'm the author events manager here at Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington. I'm so pleased to welcome you to tonight's conversation between Roosevelt Montás and Nicholas Buccola. The book tonight is Rescuing Socrates: How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation. First of all, we have a number of you in attendance tonight. I would like to invite you to use the chat window at the bottom of your screen to let us know where you're calling in from and say hello. And also through virtual events like tonight's, Third Place Books is fortunate to continue connecting authors with readers in an intimate setting. We sorely miss having authors in our store, especially on nights like tonight's, but at the same time, we're so thankful to have this new platform that brings our growing event series into your homes all across the country. So thank you for tuning in and for supporting independent bookstores. We are proud to host a number of exciting virtual events this fall, which you can find on our website, thirdplacebooks.com, including on November 16th, we have Neil Stephenson in conversation with Andy Weir, where they'll be discussing Stephenson's new novel, Termination Shock. On November 22nd, we have journalist Katie Worth in conversation with Glenn Branch, discussing Katie's new book, Miseducation: How Climate Change is Taught in America. For reminders about these events and more, I encourage you to sign up for our email newsletter at thirdplacebooks.com. As I mentioned before, the chat window at the bottom of your window is open, and we encourage you to use it respectfully. Tonight, we also have some time for your questions. So if you have questions for our authors this evening, please submit those in the Q&A window, which is separate from the chat window at the bottom of your screen. We also offer closed captioning for those of you who are interested. Just hit the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen to turn this on or off. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. But in the meantime, thank you so much for your patience and understanding. Overall, really thank you for sticking around with us during this virtual era. It is really strictly because of you that this author series is even possible. And now I am pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Roosevelt Montás is a senior lecturer at Columbia University's Center for American Studies and director of its Freedom and Citizenship program, which introduces low-income high school students to Western political tradition through the study of foundational texts. From 2008 to 2018, he was director of Columbia's Center for the Core Curriculum, and in 2000, he received the Presidential Award for Outstanding Teaching by a graduate student. Joining him tonight is Nicholas Buccola, whose books include The Fire is Upon Us, James Baldwin, William F. Buckley Jr., and the Debate Over Race in America, as well as the book The Political Thought of Frederick Douglass in Pursuit of American Liberty. He is the Elizabeth and Morris Glicksman Chair in Political Science at Linfield College in McMinnville, Oregon. Tonight's book is Rescuing Socrates: How the Great Books Changed My Life and Why They Matter for a New Generation. I want to start by saying Roosevelt has an essay in a great magazine called The Point, which recently this summer had an issue on the subject of what is college, and included many essays on the controversy and use of great books as a concept, both within and outside of academia, and as well as the very nature of teaching an exclusionary Western canon. One of the essays in this issue, as I said, is by Roosevelt, relevant to tonight's discussion, titled "What Should Students Learn?" And in it, Roosevelt writes, quote, "Debates about exclusion, domination, and representation in the core curriculum are integral, rather than a distraction from the liberal education the core delivers. The threat to the core comes not from that debate, but from those who decide out of either boredom or exhaustion that the debate is no longer worth having." Personally, I found these lines invigorating, especially since the idea of classics and what and who should be taught and read is particularly relevant to our work as booksellers, which is why I'm so pleased that Third Place Books is hosting this conversation tonight by two people who obviously believe this debate is worth having. So with that, let's get this conversation started. Please join me in welcoming Roosevelt Montás and Nick Buccola. The virtual podium is both of yours.
Thanks a lot, Spencer. I am so honored to be here with my friend Roosevelt Montás. I have been telling people that, you know, it's when a friend has a book coming out, it's kind of a harrowing experience because you sort of worry that, you know, what happens if the book isn't any good. And I've known Roosevelt for quite a while, and he's one of my favorite people. And so I was especially nervous to get my hands on Rescuing Socrates, because I thought, what if? But I had nothing to fear. This is an extraordinary book. And we thought the best way to capture some of its extraordinariness to get us started would be to have Roosevelt read an excerpt to proceed our conversation. So I'll turn the virtual floor over to Roosevelt. And thanks again to Third Place Books for hosting us. Roosevelt.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick. I so appreciate your friendship and your willingness. Even without reading the book, the moment I said, Nick, would you be willing to be my interlocutor? You said yes. So it's a vote of confidence that I appreciate, and it's in keeping with the general tenor of your friendship, your generosity. And I want to thank Third Place Books for hosting this forum, having me here tonight, for what I hope will be a stimulating and interesting conversation. And all of you who are joining us, I always feel just a deep gratitude when someone decides to give me their attention, give me some of their time, some of their mental energy, both to listen to me and perhaps even to read this book. Let me read a little excerpt from the book. This book is a very autobiographical book. It's a book that discusses the meaning and power of liberal education, but it does that by examining how liberal education has shaped my own life, and in particular, how my encounter with 4 authors have been kind of decisive in my relationship to the world, the way I understand myself. The passage I'm going to read now comes from the 2nd chapter, which is on Plato and Aristotle. 1st chapter is on St. Augustine. The 3rd chapter is on Freud. And the final 4th chapter is on Mahatma Gandhi. I encountered Aristotle for the first time when I came to college as a freshman in my literature humanities class, kind of a great book course that all first-year students at Columbia have to take. That's where I went to school as an undergraduate, where I did my PhD and have had my academic career. So I had grown up in the Dominican Republic, come to the United States at the age of 12, not speaking English, went to public schools in Queens. My family, from a rural town, I actually did not know anybody who had gone to college when I was growing up. My parents neither graduated from high school. So we were just kind of poor immigrants in Queens, New York. And kind of by a great stroke of luck, I ended up getting into Columbia. But as you might imagine, going to Columbia, to an Ivy League institution with a few students like me, but mainly students who were not only very accomplished, but who had grown up with a lot of privilege and a lot of opportunities and a quality of education that I simply did not have. So my first year at Columbia was quite a ride. And this passage I'm going to read is about my first encounter with Aristotle in a class that first year. It's the beginning of the 2nd chapter, which is called The Examined Life: Socrates, Plato, and a little bit of Aristotle. The first institution resembling a university was founded by Plato on the outskirts of Athens around the year 387 BC. The spot had been named for the mythological hero Academus, so the school came to be known simply as the Academy. Some 20 years after its founding, the Academy received a 17-year-old Macedonian student named Aristotle, who remained there until Plato's death in 347 BC, and eventually founded his own school of philosophy, the Lyceum. In a move that would come to characterize the philosophical tradition the two men launched, Aristotle made his name not by venerating the doctrines of his teacher, but by disputing them. These two, Plato and Aristotle, are the uncontested giants of philosophy. I read and loved Plato's dialogues in high school, but did not encounter Aristotle until my freshman year of college. That first encounter didn't go very well. Part of the problem was that the charm and beauty of Plato's writing had set the bar for what I expected of philosophy. Recalling how jarring the contrast can be, I warned my contemporary civilization students as they approached Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, which comes right after Plato's Republic, that reading Aristotle can feel like chewing on cardboard. Don't expect enchantment from Aristotle. The text I read as a freshman was the Poetics, and that also was part of the problem. The class was Literature Humanities, the first year core curriculum requirement where some months after Aristotle, I would read St. Augustine. Though it wasn't on the official reading list for the course, Professor Wallace Gray dropped the Poetics on us in the middle of a spate of ancient Greek plays. Perhaps I could have gotten past the pedantic and arid style, allowing for the fact that the Poetics is probably a set of lecture notes rather than a finished book. But beyond the style, I really didn't like what Aristotle had to say. I remember one particular claim that seemed to me outrageous. Quote, beauty is a matter of size and order, he said. Just like that. I couldn't believe the crudity. I didn't just disagree, I found the idea offensive. I could not accept the notion that beauty is reducible to a formula of constituent elements. To me, it seemed like saying that life is a matter of circulation and perspiration. It missed the point. I felt that beauty had to be beyond analysis, irreducible to quantities. My first paper that semester was a disjointed diatribe against Aristotle for what I took to be his degrading treatment of poetry. Wallace Gray was not impressed. In his comments, he asked that I come to see him in his office and wondered why I hadn't appealed to romantics like Edgar Allan Poe and Friedrich Schlegel, who shared my views on beauty and poetry. I didn't tell him, but the reason I didn't cite them was that I didn't know what a romantic was, or that Poe was one, or who Schlegel was. I didn't think that it mattered. My views did not derive from literary authorities. They were just what I felt to be true. So I went to his office in Hamilton Hall to discuss the paper. It was my first use of that college ritual called the office hour. I felt very distinctly that I was in trouble. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't find a way to get out of it. I appeared at the appointed hour and waited on the bench outside of his office until the person ahead of me walked out. I went in slowly, frightened. The way I remember it, Professor Gray didn't even say hello, but launched right into the reason he wanted to talk to me. In your paper, he says, you come across as rather cocky. That word froze me. It was clear from the way he said it that he expected a response. There was only one way I could respond. I swallowed hard and said timidly, I'm sorry, Professor, but I don't know what that word means. This was a poignant instance of an experience I still encounter on occasion. Some schoolyard word or expression escaped my book-driven learning of English, and the gap shows up at an inopportune hour. This time, Professor Gray softened his voice and found a nice way to tell me what the word meant. I imagine it was hard to reconcile the voice he encountered in the paper with the shy and mousy students he saw in class. I could see what Professor Gray was getting at, and I knew that what he was interpreting as cockiness was something else, something I could not then name or see through, but which I understood was intertwined with my whole experience at Columbia. I had arrived at Columbia dazed. My memories of that first year have a jagged vividness of a fever dream. While my English was good enough to be admitted to college, if barely, my cultural fluency and ability to mingle with fellow students was nowhere close to functional. In some hazy and confused way, I knew this, but couldn't admit it to myself. Professor Gray was detecting my struggle to find a place in a situation I could not decipher. I took Professor Gray's word cocky in stride. I didn't feel insulted or deflated, but still it stung. Professor Gray was poking at the exoskeleton I was building to survive Columbia. That shield created a dead space between me and my classmates I never bridged as an undergraduate. It would take me many years to see that the distance I kept from my peers was a way of maintaining dignity in the face of an incapacity to engage with them on equal terms. This is what Wallace Gray saw me doing in that paper dismissing Aristotle as insufferably crass, though neither of us knew it. Okay. I read that to, in some way, give you a sense of the voice in which the book is written, the flavor of my approach to thinking about liberal education and writing about the great books.
Thank you, Roosevelt. That was great. so many things to discuss tonight, and hopefully that gives the audience a sense of what this book is like. I personally found that to be one of the most compelling things about it, this mixture of autobiography with, you know, this engagement with big philosophical and political questions. I'm curious, you know, maybe while we're in that spirit, if you can, you know, sort of describe, there's a couple of moments, there's a line in the book when you say, each of our memories is a riddle, and you sort of play around with that idea. And there's two moments, there's so many moments in the book that just are extraordinarily powerful, but there was two that I thought might be good ways into, you know, two of the big things that you're weaving in the text. One is July 1991, a moment that was just so powerful for me. You're in your room, you're about to head off to Colombia, and a relative, Dulce, knocks on your door and hands you an envelope. And you talk about that moment and sort of, you know, so maybe not quite what it meant to you at the time, but when you reflected on it later, how important it was and how it symbolized this kind of bridge of your story from the Dominican Republic to that moment when you're about to go to Colombia. Can you tell us about the envelope a little bit and just what that moment means?
Thank you. I had that memory. This comes up in the first chapter of the book, where I discuss St. Augustine's Confessions, which is a book a lot about memory. So it's a book a lot about his own reflection, his own understanding of his own life. I encountered that book as a first-year student, and it had a really powerful effect on me. And you know, memory is a funny thing, but this memory came back to me while I was after graduate school. I was a full-grown adult, and one day I was alone in my house, and I don't know what triggered it, but I remember that night, the night before I left my house in Queens to move to the dorm at Columbia, to join a summer program called the Higher Education Opportunity Program. It's a kind of summer bridge program for at-risk students who are disadvantaged in some way, who are either socioeconomically or educationally disadvantaged, or a combination of both. And that night, I went to bed and heard a knock on the door. It was Dulce, the mother of my closest friend at the time, was also my second cousin, and she gave me this envelope. Had $80 in it, and she had collected that money from friends and relatives, and it was a send-off. It was a gift, but it also, you know, Dulce, no one in my family understood what was happening. No one went to college, certainly not a residential college, certainly not an Ivy League college. Nobody knew what the Ivy League was. Somehow Dulce understood that this night was a different night in my life, that there was something about to happen that was momentous. And it's not something that I even could recognize. And then the next day, when I moved into the dorm, I was carrying this envelope with $80 in it. And it struck me, the fact that I have forgotten that, the fact that somehow that envelope represented both the aspirations of my community. It also represented my walking away from a world that I would, in fact, never return to. And it also embodied the precariousness of my life. The precariousness that's what I showed up with to Colombia. It was with $80, and it was $80 that somebody gave me the night before I left. And it seemed to me that not until the moment in my personal intellectual development when I could come to terms, accept, and somehow digest just the magnitude of my precarity and the distance that I traveled that day, did that memory come. And you know, this happens to me, probably happens to many of you, that maybe to all of us, that some small trigger can unleash like a high voltage discharge of memory. And when that memory came back to me, I was in tears. And so yeah, it became significant to me to understand why I had suppressed that memory and why at that moment that memory came back to me.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I'm trying not to get emotional just thinking about that moment. That moment just really hit me, and hearing me describe it here hits me again. Sticking with the theme of tears, I don't want to make everybody cry, but it's I think there's another moment in the text that I thought jumped out to me that was just sort of a symbol of this. You're grappling with this question of what constitutes a great book, right? And what is our sort of relationship, the relationship of the self, and the sort of making and remaking of the self by way of engagement with text that kind of runs through your life and comes out so powerfully in the book. And I thought a moment, if we fast forward from July 1991 and that beautiful encounter with Dulce to, I'm guessing based on the Lit Hum syllabus, maybe March, April, and we're in the classroom with Professor Gray, the aforementioned Professor Gray, who you referred to in your in the excerpt that you read. And there's a group of about 20 students in a room with Professor Gray, and you say you can recall sort of discussing Dostoevsky that week, and Professor Gray being moved to tears in talking about that text with the class. I'm just wondering if that can be a portal in to sort of getting you to discuss this idea of a great book and what it means to you and why you think it matters so much.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that this book argues for is first of all a liberal education, and a liberal education is a kind of education that tries to get at this condition of freedom that we have, the fact that we are the types of beings that experience ourselves as self-determining. That is, we have the capacity, we experience ourselves as having the capacity to organize our life according to our own subjective conception of the good. And that, of course, freedom is terrifying. And that freedom is complex. And a liberal education, rather than trying to prepare you to be an engineer or a doctor or a lawyer or a business person, tries to equip you to live out that condition of freedom in the fullest and most meaningful way possible. How do you do that in an education? Well, a lot of schools do it through the humanities, right? That is through exploring works of literature, of philosophy, of art that somehow grapple with and have shown a capacity to stimulate the kind of thinking, the kind of sensibility, the kind of depth of self-awareness that is conducive to a free life. I argue in the book for the necessity, the urgent necessity to renew this function of education. To liberal arts is a threatened, it's an endangered species in the university, and so part of the argument of the book is about the importance of that approach to education. That education in college not just be job preparation, not just be career education, not just be practical. Sure, it needs to be that, but it also needs to be this other thing, and it is this other thing that we are neglecting and have neglected. Then I make a further argument that the most powerful way to do this education is by reading or encountering great books. Now, great books, there is no ultimate definition of what a great book is. There is no ultimate list of what a great book is. And it doesn't only mean books, it's also art, it's also music, but great works, right? What makes a great work great, in my view, is its capacity to illuminate our shared human experience. And that cuts against a certain understanding. There are some people who think or who argue that there is no such thing as a great book, really, that every book, in fact, is merely a product of its historical moment, and that it is only valuable in its kind of historical connection to an individual. And part of that, it means that, you know, there's a kind of identity argument that goes with that. So sometimes people will say, oh, you know, if you're African American, the works that will be really valuable to you are works that deal with that situation. If you're Hispanic, if you're an immigrant. And I want to say that great books go beyond that. You know, I can read Dante, who writes in the 13th century, 13th, 14th century Florence, steeped in the Catholic Church, steeped in the kind of infighting of Florentine politics. I have no connection to that, no knowledge of that, no interest in that, and yet Dante can speak to me and illuminate my own humanity, illuminate my own experience as a 21st century Dominican immigrant to New York City. Dante is able to do that because Dante speaks within his time, but also beyond his time. It's the same quality that makes Toni Morrison, for example, a great writer. It is not that Toni Morrison is steeped in the legacy of African-American slavery. That's not what makes her great. What makes her great is that she can take that experience and make it real, make it vivid, make it relevant to somebody who has no connection to that experience. This capacity that certain works have to shed light on the commonality of our human experience, because we all live with a set of kind of existential dilemmas. We all live with this condition of freedom. We all live with an awareness of mortality. We all live social lives that are constituted and depend on our social relationships. And this condition that we have raises really the most important questions that we all have to live with. The things that really matter when you close your eyes and you turn out the lights, the things that really matter to your sense of yourself, to the meaning of your life, to your being. Those questions haven't changed that much for 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years. And those questions continue to give us the ability to communicate across cultural, across historical, across class lines. And so great books are books that are able to do that. Great books are you know, not just books, again, works of art, etc., are books that are able to connect us in some fundamental way to our own experience of humanity. That's what the Columbia Core Curriculum is about. And that's and part of what I argue is that liberal education ought to make a concerted effort to place students in contact with works that are like this. Sorry to go on and on.
Oh, no. That was beautiful. And I was wondering, this might be a good point to ask you a little bit more about, you know, the biography of this book, right? You know, because in a way, I think one of the things that is so powerful about what you've done here, you have this line early on in the book where you say, you know, one of the reasons that liberal education is so hard to defend in certain contexts is because it's like defining it or describing it as like describing the plot of a novel to someone, right? You describe the plot of a novel, you know, to someone who hasn't read the novel, it's probably not going to, you know, seem quite as powerful to someone who's actually been inside that story and so on. So one of the things I think that, you know, I was thinking about just in terms of your journey as a writer, that'd be interesting to hear from you is like the story of how this book came to be. I mean, you talk in the book a bit about, you know, sort of what you were doing with a lot of your time over the years, but it struck me as a book where, you know, you know, probably different parts of the story you had to tell, different parts of it occurred to you over time. And then it really, you know, what we now hold in our hands, this extraordinary book, is really this process of you weaving all those things together in this beautiful way. But I imagine it's, you know, if your experience is anything like my own, you stumbled toward that beautiful thing as opposed to having a grand plan in the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about the biography of the book?
Yeah, sure. You know, in some ways, this book reflects my relationship to academia. Sometimes I say that my expertise is in amateurism. That is, I have my official field of expertise is 19th century American intellectual history. I teach that stuff. I write about that stuff, not as much as I write about liberal education, but it had always seemed to me difficult to give my best intellectual energies to questions, academic questions that were so specialized that they only mattered to a narrow group of people. Now, you and I know that that's how you make an academic career, especially in the humanities and the social sciences. You master a specialized corner of knowledge in which you make original contributions, but by virtue of its specialization, those original contributions only make sense and only are in dialogue with another very small group of experts. And from my work as a teacher and from my work as a speaker, for many years, I spent 10 years as director of the Columbia program, which is how you and I first met. And going around both Columbia, but also beyond Columbia, throughout the United States and in many places abroad, arguing for this kind of education. And it at some point became obvious to me that the little engine that was firing me, the combustion engine, had to do with my personal experience. The reason why I felt so passionate about this, the reason why that turned me on, the reason why I would rather write about that and talk about that than other academic subjects, is because what it had done to me. I had fire in my belly about that stuff. And even though up until I wrote this book, and you've heard me speak before, I would never draw on that. I would never present my kind of own life story as the exhibit A or something. When I began to think about writing a book, and an editor at Princeton approached me, had heard me speak various places, and said, let's try to get a book out. And I began to think, what kind of book can I write? It seemed to me that the only book I could write was a book that encompassed all of me. It couldn't just be a book about my expertise in American higher education. It couldn't just be a book about my expertise in curriculum development. It couldn't just be a book about the various kind of expertise I have developed around these books that I teach. It had to be a book that came from the entirety of me. It had to be a book that somehow spoke from my whole experience. And that meant that it had to be a book that was going to deal with the fact that I'm an immigrant, the fact that I don't come from a background where there was higher education, the fact that I grew up dirt poor, the fact that I've been divorced, the fact that I've spent years in psychoanalysis, the fact that I, as a teenager, had a profound religious experience and conversion and then moved away from that. It seemed to me that I had to find a way to speak with my real voice, not with some garb, some mask or some constraint, and it was surprising to me that when I began to write that way, it was like opening a faucet. The thing was flowing. I did not know when I would sit down to write about this text, I didn't know what parts of my life were going to come up. In my Freud chapter, I spent some time talking about free association, and about how one idea leads to the other. And those of you, I mean, you've done it, Nick, but those of you who read the book will notice that the book just flows very much by association. This one instance gets me to think about this, gets me to reflect and to understand this other thing. And in that way, it means to illustrate what a liberal education does. In that way, it means to illustrate that a liberal education is something that's embedded in your whole life experience. A liberal education is not about learning stuff about the books. A liberal education is about learning about your own life, about your own inner life, through the provocation, through the stimulus, informed by those books that you read. But ultimately, the one quote that I love is from Montaigne. Montaigne writes in his essay on experience, "I study myself more than any other subject. This is my metaphysics. This is my physics." I love that, because self-knowledge is ultimately the object of a liberal education. It's really about self-knowledge. So if this book was going to be about liberal education, I was going to have to lay bare my own process of self-knowledge. And it's not a thing that's said and done. It's a thing that you live with. It's a way of living. It's a way of navigating the complexities, the dilemmas, the difficulties, the realities of your life. And so this book ended up being, about a third memoir, because it's really about how liberal education has allowed me to understand this particular life that I have lived.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think that's the magic. That's the magic that you captured in this book, so powerfully. I mean, I guess there's so much with the four authors that we could discuss. I mean, maybe I'll put out a general idea, and you can maybe feel free to, to bring any of the four in who you think strike you as especially relevant. But just on that last point, on this amazing ability you have to draw on the particular, to talk about these universal things and think about universal things and bring them back to the particular throughout the book. I was wondering if you might say something about the sort of reflections you have on your father in the book. And I was thinking about it. This is an idea that's been on my mind for a while for various reasons. Some coming out of the Baldwin Buckley thing. Thinking about sort of the relationships, our relationships to our fathers, alongside of the idea of patriotism, right, as a kind of love of the fatherland, and that sort of common, etymological origin. And I was thinking about your reflections on your father, which are tough. There are moments, there are some tough reflections there. They come up, I would say maybe more in the Plato chapter than they do in the Freud chapter.
Right.
But then there's also, just to put that alongside, and I'm not really sure if this is your intention or just me imposing something on the text, but to put that alongside, what I found in the book was a really profound set of reflections on patriotism in like a deep sense, not in a kind of vulgar sense, but a really interesting. There are moments of just where your love for the Dominican Republic and your love for the United States come through so beautifully, but not uncritically. And so I just wonder if you could put those things together or think about them separately, if that's better. But I just wanted to put that out there as a way into these four authors. Yeah.
My father is very much in this book. My father, who has a sixth grade education, has been the formative intellectual influence in my life. Even though he, when I moved to the United States, he didn't come, and I lost touch with him for many years. And by the time we reconnected, I was an adult. So it's that early influence. If I may, I think maybe I'll just read a little passage in which I discuss my father. This passage comes from the Plato chapter. There's a moment, Socrates has been condemned to death, and Socrates he's an old man. He's 70, which is very old for ancient times. But he has young children, including a baby. And an old friend of his, comes and tries to persuade him, and has made arrangements to flee the jail, to escape death sentence that he has been given. And one of the arguments he makes is, you have young children, and to not take this opportunity to escape, you are depriving, you're orphaning your children. You have a moral responsibility to your children to do what you can to stay alive and be there for them. And that Socrates declines. Socrates says, no, I can't do that, and I accept the death penalty. But the death, that really rung profound bells for me about certain choices that my father made. So I'm going to read a few pages from that chapter. When the friend says to Socrates, you're kind of cowardly for taking the easy way out and orphaning your children. I say that the argument carries force not just as it concerns Socrates' current predicament, but as it concerns his whole way of life with its voluntary poverty. Socrates might choose that life for himself, but is it right for him to choose a life of poverty for his children? When I first read Crito's argument all the way down to this day, this passage carries uncomfortable questions for me. As various family members were eager to point out, always it seemed to me with a tinge of schadenfreude. My father, who came to the US along with my brother and me in 1985 and could have stayed, decided not to. He walked away, leaving us in the charge of our ill-equipped mother, penniless and in the frightening New York City of the 1980s. Dad could not endure the humiliating marginality and helplessness of what would be his life in Nueva York. He went back to Cambita, that's where we're from. Broken-hearted and with a cloud of opprobrium hanging over his head, he left. He had no phone in Cambita, and there was no mail service by which to maintain regular communication. So his departure meant that his presence in my life would be reduced to the rare letter and the even rarer visit, both of which would entirely stop after he lost his visa. We had come to the country on green cards, so he could not stay out of the country longer than 6 months, and he could not afford to buy a plane ticket every 6 months just to keep his visa valid. After exhausting his eligibility for a special 2-year permit, he let his green card expire. A green card, let it be noted, is the most coveted visa a foreigner can get, granting permanent residence in the United States and automatic eligibility to apply for citizenship. It is a thing for which Dominicans literally kill themselves, braving in wooden boats to land on US soil in Puerto Rico. He let it expire, along with the possibility of entering the country where his teenage sons were trying to find a way to live. This is how it came to pass that our father abandoned us. Nobody approved. I have not been able to muster any real resentment toward my dad for this. I've tried, but the results have always been half-hearted. My wife suggests that this is partly in self-defense, allowing me to preserve a certain image of him that is important to my own sense of self. Perhaps. I remember his misery the few times he attempted to establish himself in the US. It was oppressive to me. Had he stayed, I think it would have poisoned my life. In his response to Crito, Socrates hardly engages this argument, offering a passing dismissal. As for those questions you raise about money, reputation, and upbringing of children, Crito, these considerations in truth belong to those people who easily put men to death and would bring them to life again if they could without thinking. Socrates' deflection did not apply to me, to my case. How do I evaluate whether my father made the right decision? Things have worked out all right for me, my older brother and my mom, and they have worked out all right for his DR family, including my 2 half-siblings. Our relationship is fine. But how do I judge whether what he did as he should have done? How do I measure his responsibility to me and my brother against his responsibility to my younger siblings in DR and to his partner there, who was for a time my stepmother? These questions, which I ask myself and continue to ask myself, are also the questions my father had to ask of himself and answer. I never have to spend much time with him before realizing again that this decision left a wound in him that has never healed. I see this in his solicitude and deference to me. I see it in the joy that overwhelms him when he first sees me after a period of absence. I see it in the tears that predictably flood his eyes every time we say goodbye. Like the questions that mattered to Socrates about the nature of the good, justice, truth, and the life worth living, my questions are not subject to a final determination. They are irreducible to calculable certitude. Yet they are the proper subjects of rational inquiry, as Socrates insists. A liberal education is one that takes the complicated condition of human freedom seriously and addresses itself to its dilemmas and to the urgency of its lived experience. To think and reason through these kinds of questions is to learn to live with them in an honest and ongoing way. These questions from a decisive period in my development and about a formative relationship in my sense of self shaped the character of my inner life. They are the questions in whose tensions I improvise my daily existence, including the writing of this book. While the specific details of the questions will vary from individual to individual, every human life is like this, balanced between imponderables. The great questions of philosophy and the unique questions that concern only me in my individual particularity are always intersecting, always infiltrating each other. Learning to see my particular in the universal is no small help to living sanely.
Wow, man, I could just listen to you read all night. That's beautiful stuff. And if I should note to the audience, if you like audiobooks, Roosevelt does narrate his own book, so you can hear him read you the text alongside owning a copy. I think I recommend that for everybody. On that, it's another just extraordinary passage and such beautiful writing. I want to ask, that may be a good transition. To bring Freud and Gandhi into the conversation a little bit, before we go to audience questions. I guess that moment in the text when you're describing, Socrates defending this kind of rational self interrogation and so on and so forth. It sets up the next. We go from Plato in your book to Freud, right? And you describe so beautifully. Via Freud, the destruction of the specialness of the self, right? Galileo revealing that we're not the center of the universe, Darwin revealing we're not the center of nature, and Freud saying we're not even the center of ourselves, right? I think that was such a powerful literary move, but also just an existential move, right? To take us there to Freud when you're sort of describing. Again, weaving your autobiography, weaving your first marriage, just revealing yourself, right? In so many ways, in such a courageous way. And then talking about the ways in which a lot of the illusions of rationality and so on really fell away, and you had to sort of remake yourself in a fundamental sense. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that sort of process of the undoing of the self and the remaking of the self, and then just to bring Gandhi in at the end here, a little bit. Gandhi, the Gandhi chapter is one in which you're coming back to the question with you start the text with Augustine, right? What is worth striving for, right? What is worth dying for? And I think that those two things, right, those are two very big questions. The destruction of the self, and then what makes life worth living, a lot there. But I'm just wondering if you can, bring Freud and Gandhi into the conversation a little bit here.
One thing that Freud gives us, Freud can be very unsettling, and a lot of people just dismiss Freud. And there's lots about Freud that is dismissible. That is, Freud made certain claims about clinical practice and certain understanding that was kind of very rigid. And so very often the first thing people do is dismiss Freud. And part of that, I think, is because Freud is so unsettling. Because if you take Freud seriously, it really recasts the way that you relate to yourself and the way that you relate to your own experience. And the big thing in Freud is Freud's theorizing of the unconscious. Freud's, and the image that best captures is Freud's understanding of the mind is that is of an iceberg, right? An iceberg, the visible part of the iceberg above the surface is often like 10% of the iceberg. And then underneath there's this mass of iceberg. But we tend to just point to the thing that sticks out above the water and say that's the iceberg. But the conscious life, the conscious mind, your sense of self, your present sense of self, is just that tip of the iceberg. And there's this vast repository of mental activity, of forces, of desires, of inclinations, of kind of pre-programming that you're not conscious of. So that you yourself are a terra incognita, you yourself are a mystery. And to live in a way where you are suspicious of your uncertainties, where you are looking for ways to get a sense of and make peace with that unconscious. That really recasts your life, and it's not a comfortable place to be. And sometimes I ask students as a way of demonstrating how the reality of the unconscious is to you know, and all of you today, you know, many of you might be home or elsewhere, but if you go to the grocery store, let's say, your mind will immediately begin to wander. The moment that we turn off, the moment that you turn off this computer and this Zoom, your mind is going to begin to wander. You will think about conversations you've had today, about plans of things you'll do tomorrow, blah, blah, blah. And you are just walking like you're riding a train and you're not the conductor. Thoughts come, thoughts go. And it just, and you, where do they come from? Why do they come? We don't know. You're not driving that process. And if you, does anybody who has experienced meditation, mindfulness meditation, you see it. It's this watchful observance of where your mind goes. And it's a vivid demonstration that your sense of control of your mind is an illusion. Things come from a place we don't understand and don't control. Living in this way, living with that reality, can be uncomfortable, but it also adds a tremendous richness, tremendous kind of possibilities for really adventuresome, experimental. You know, dreams are this way. When you have a dream, it's like you have a message from your unconscious. What was your mind thinking about? What were you grappling with? And it's like a riddle that you can examine and try to learn something about yourself that you did not know by examining your dreams, by examining your what Freud called parapraxis, the things that you forget, the slips of the tongue, the mistakes that you make. So that was a tremendous contribution, has been a tremendous contribution to my own life, to my own understanding, to my own capacity to put together my experiences. Then comes Gandhi, who is another radical experimenting with the self. Gandhi subtitled his autobiography, "The Story of My Experiments with Truth." Gandhi's whole life was a dedicated pursuit of self-understanding, of understanding the deep forces that were at work in his experience of phenomena. In my own, Gandhi for me has represented a kind of return to a certain kind of spirituality. I mentioned before that I had a kind of powerful experience with Christianity as a teenager. I walked away from it. But Gandhi has opened a way for me to re-engage with transcendental and spiritual questions. In a way, you know, part of the thing that these books and all of these thinkers do is that it tries to heal the rift between like the intellect and what you might call the spirit. Gandhi has also been important in my life, and I think it's important as a thinker in addressing a situation, the consequences of which we live today, which is there's a crisis of truth. And in the academy, there is a crisis of truth where the very idea of truth has been kind of put under erasure. There's, you know, very serious thinkers who just reject the category of truth. You know, in a way, if you think about it as a kind of academic little philosophical debate, but when that stuff begins to infiltrate the way that we organize our politics, the way that we organize our social lives, as it has, we find ourselves in a very, very deep and ugly place, where there is no, where there is a crisis of confidence in what is true and what is not, in our capacity to discern what the truth is. As a society, we are in a moment of really precarious relationship to truth. So Gandhi is a way to reconstitute, I think, our faith in truth. Spencer, you're back.
Hey, Spencer's back. Yes, yes.
No,
right. Yeah, go ahead, Spencer.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say I'm here to usher in a few questions from the audience. We have a few minutes left here, and we have a few great questions lined up. The first of which is from Laura, who asks, and I'm going to paste this in the chat for everyone to see as well. She says, While greatness encompasses vividly portraying the human experience, what criteria do you use to deem a work of art or literature great? Do you believe popular literature, for example, such as genre fiction, has qualities of greatness? And this is a great question for both of you, I think, so feel free to answer.
Well, it's a great question. First, I would just say that I think that there isn't a one single criteria upon which you can judge this. And my own way of thinking is to look, it's kind of take almost like an empirical approach and see which works have proven their capacity to illuminate our human experience to many different kinds of people in many different kinds of historical circumstances. Now, that does place kind of an emphasis on old books. I think it's much easier to make a determination about old books than about current books. It's very hard to figure out which of the current books are going to have that kind of lasting power. Nonetheless, I absolutely agree, and that popular forms of art, whether it's popular literature, film, music, that popular works can have this quality of greatness, that is, can have the capacity to speak to our most profound sense of humanity, and to do so for many different kinds of people in many different kinds of historical moments. Now, that historical part, it will take time to figure out which of the contemporary popular works that we feel do that are actually going to prove themselves to do that over time. But absolutely, I think that this quality or this set of qualities that I identify as greatness can and do appear in popular works. Nick, what's your thoughts on this?
I mean, that's a great question, Laura. I ran away from the computer just to show that this week in my Race in the American Story class, I'm teaching a graphic novel on the Black Panther Party. In part, I mean, that's actually the question that my small group of students, about 14 students, and I are working our way through, a lot of, great books, Frederick Douglass, Zora Neale Hurston, Baldwin, and now we've arrived at this. And so one of the things we started with is what, how do we think about this as a form, right? I mean, what are the students getting? What truths are coming through to them, or questions are emerging for them in this form, where you have, much, less text to work with, but all these images and this different way of telling the story and teaching history. What are they seeing that they wouldn't have seen maybe if they were reading a massive, narrative history of the Black Panther Party, or reading the primary sources, and also what is missing, right? What are they unable to get from this form? So, I mean, I do think, I agree with everything Roosevelt said. I don't think there's much of a gap, in how I'd answer the question. I do think that, it's worth pondering, right? What it is when we teach, for example, or we're engaging with, as you say, genre fiction, or something that's more widely read. How does that lead us to, what kinds of questions does that lead us to ask? And is there something about, something's form that will necessarily limit our understanding, or are there ways in? But I think also Roosevelt's point about time is really important as well. I mean, there are things that we encounter now and sort of see something of value in them, or enjoy them, but we're not really sure if they're speaking in some profound way, like the text that Roosevelt's grappling with in Rescuing Socrates. But yeah, definitely an excellent question. But as a teacher, though, I definitely I'm very much of the mind that I want my students to encounter the sorts of books that Roosevelt's discussing in his book. But I also I'll be teaching a politics and film class in the spring, and I think we'll do some classics and some movies that we're not so sure about yet. So yeah, definitely a great question.
I heard somebody say that in order to be great, an author must be dead. I wouldn't go quite that far, but there is something about time that helps put things into perspective.
Yeah, that's actually interesting. There's that John, if I can also throw in my just one thought, there's that John Erskine quote where he talks about teaching the great books and how he wanted his students to read great books as spontaneously and I think humanly as they would read like current bestsellers.
Right.
And that always strikes me. Yeah, that's always interesting to me because I've never, you know, as someone who sells bestsellers and is surrounded by, you know, what is kind of like of the zeitgeist of the day. It's interesting to think of what in 5 and 10 and 15, 50 years from now is going to be canonized.
I've always wondered, I've had this idea how cool it would be to have people who have mastered the genre of the book review.
Yeah.
To, you know, write a book review of the Iliad. Just make believe it came out last week, and a book review of the Iliad, book review of Hamlet. You know, that would be great.
Well, it's funny because people do write reviews, reviews of new translations of certain texts. They're not, you know, reviewing Homer per se. They're reviewing, you know, what is the difference between this translation to a past translation. But I always think those are fun. It's like bringing classics back into conversation in popular publications.
Right.
We'll end with, we have one last question here from Edward, who asks, or he says, a liberal education produces an examined life, but it also produces the skills, tools, and notes for living a life of improvisation. What are your thoughts on this? And he includes a quote from jazz guitarist Pat Martino, who said, jazz was a walk without a particular route or destination.
Yeah. You know, I'm an Americanist. It's my field, and there is something in the American way, or whatever one could say. It's like characteristically American that is concerned with newness and improvisation, and then even when you zero in even further, I can think of no better embodiment of that than jazz. Jazz to me is the most American thing that America has ever produced. And it's got all of the contradictions of America in there. You know, it's got its roots in the brutalization of an American population, and yet the creativity and the joy and the blues. I mean, it's all there. The spontaneity, freedom. Jazz strikes me as this extraordinary expression of enactment of freedom. And you know, you hear a jazz ensemble and it's like a democratic endeavor where different things come to the fore and things collaborate in an unstructured and heterogeneous way, but coming together to create something that everybody is invested in. So liberal education, I said, is about freedom. Liberal education is about how to live the life of freedom, and the life of freedom is characterized by its non-calculability. That is, by its fundamental irreducibility to calculus, to prediction, to determination. It is indeterminate in a fundamental way. So spontaneity, creativity, these are, I think, kind of different facets, different expressions of the fundamental condition that liberal arts education concerns itself with.
How am I going to top that? I mean, that's just so beautiful. Yeah, I mean, and I want to, I want Roosevelt to have the last word, but I guess what I'd say, just to put to amplify what Roosevelt just said, and I think what comes through so powerfully in the book is the two of the ideas that Roosevelt's grappling with are freedom and virtue, and virtue understood really broadly as a life well lived. And I think that that precisely that point that Roosevelt was just making about freedom also comes through in the book on this question of virtue. And it's not a book that's going to catalog the virtues for you and tell you how to live, but it's going to provide this incredibly powerful example of Roosevelt probing into himself and describing all these really powerful moments in his own life, and how these great books have helped him understand those moments and prepare to improvise for whatever comes next. So it really is truly a remarkable book. I'm not going to call it a great book because I want Roosevelt to stay alive for a long, long time. But it is really an amazing book. I think it's going to be a book that's going to be talked about for quite a long time. I think Roosevelt's pulled off something really, really wonderful. So I'm so honored to be here. And yeah, I don't want to say the last word, Spencer. So you get Spencer. Spencer should turn it over to Roosevelt. But thank you for having.
Yeah, absolutely. Any final thoughts, Roosevelt, before we close out tonight?
No, except to thank everyone for your attention, and I guess I would say that the project of this book is about bringing us all to deeper reflection of our own human experience, and that's something that I hope this book helps people do, but their everyday lives and the world around them will also help them do that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you so much, Roosevelt. Thank you so much, Nick.
Thank you, Nick.
Stimulating conversation tonight. Yeah, it's so wonderful to have you both on the same screen together. Third Place Books has plenty of copies of Rescuing Socrates ready for you to come pick up, or you can order online, thirdplacebooks.com. We are, so proud to carry this book, so proud to host this conversation. Other than that, on behalf of the bookstore, have a wonderful evening, everyone, and please be well.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
guys. Thank you.